The sun beat down on the dusty plains, baking the sand to a shimmering haze. Twisted metal scraps littered the landscape like forgotten bones of giant machines. In the distance, a dark shape clawed at the horizon, the mad inventor's workshop. It wasn't a building, not really. More like a metal spider, its legs spindly towers of iron and steam pipes reaching for the sky. Smoke belched from its chimneys, staining the otherwise clear blue with streaks of gray. Strange whirring sounds and clanking noises echoed across the empty space, carried on the hot, dry wind. Folks whispered about the mad inventor, calling him crazy and dangerous. They said he built terrible things inside that workshop, things powered by steam and fueled by madness. No one dared to go near it, except maybe for scraps of metal they could find lying around the perimeter. But even then, they kept one eye on the horizon, ready to run if they saw any movement near the iron spider. The workshop itself seemed alive, pulsating with the heat of its inner workings. Gears ground against each other, pistons pumped, and steam hissed from every joint. It was a monster made of metal, a testament to the inventor's twisted genius. He had transformed the quiet desert into a mechanical nightmare, a place where dreams rusted and hope withered under the scorching sun. Little did the inventor know, a storm was brewing on the horizon. A storm named Clara, and she was heading straight for his doorstep, ready to turn his metal monster against him. The desert wind carried a whisper of change, a promise of sparks and steam, and maybe, just maybe, a little bit of hope. Inside the workshop, the air hung thick with the smell of coal smoke and hot oil. Shadows danced on the walls, cast by flickering gas lamps that hissed and spat. In the center of the largest chamber, a monstrous machine loomed. It was made of iron and brass, a tangle of gears, pistons, and chains. Steam hissed from its valves, and the whole thing vibrated with barely contained power. Strapped tightly to this contraption was Elsie. Her dress, once a pretty shade of blue, was now stained with grease and grime. Ropes bound her wrists and ankles to the cold metal frame. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the mechanical rhythm of the machine. She strained against the restraints, but they held firm. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the dirt that clung to her skin. Elsie wasn't a fighter, not really. She was a baker's daughter, used to the warmth of the oven and the sweet smell of bread. But she had a spirit, a stubborn refusal to give up, even in the face of this terrible machine. She squeezed her eyes shut, picturing her father's bakery, the comforting routine of kneading dough and shaping loaves. It was a memory she clung to, a lifeline in this metal hell. The machine groaned and shuddered. A large metal plate suspended above her slowly began to descend. It was studded with sharp spikes, glinting menacingly in the lamplight. Elsie gasped, her breath catching in her throat. This was it. This was how it ended, not with the smell of baking bread, but with the crushing weight of the mad inventor's machine. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, a tiny spark of hope flickered within. Maybe, just maybe, someone would come. Maybe someone cared enough to save her. Outside, Clara crouched low, her eyes scanning the workshop's perimeter. She wore a battered leather duster, its pockets bulging with strange tools and wires. A pair of goggles perched on her forehead, pushed back from her face, revealing sharp, intelligent eyes. She wasn't your typical cowboy. Instead of a six-shooter, she carried a modified wrench, its handle wrapped in copper wire. And instead of a horse, she relied on her wits and a healthy dose of daring. Clara had heard rumors about the mad inventor and his cruel experiments. She hadn't believed them at first, dismissing them as tall tales told around campfires. But then a desperate message had reached her, carried by a runaway stagecoach driver. A message that spoke of a woman held captive, a woman about to be crushed by a steam-powered nightmare. That's all it took. Clara wasn't one to stand by while injustice happened. She was a hacker, a tinkerer, a breaker of rules. She knew her way around machines, could coax them to do things they weren't meant to do. And she had a knack for getting into places she wasn't supposed to be. Taking a deep breath, Clara pulled a small, rectangular device from her pocket. It was a homemade gizmo, cobbled together from spare parts and powered by a clockwork mechanism. She called it her lockpick. With nimble fingers, she attached the device to a nearby steam pipe, its tiny gears whirring softly. A moment later, a section of the pipe hissed open, revealing a narrow passage into the workshop. It was a tight squeeze, but Clara didn't hesitate. She was in. The rescue had begun, and Elsie, trapped inside that monstrous machine, had a fighting chance. Clara knew she had to work fast. The passage led her into a narrow maintenance tunnel, barely wide enough to crawl through. The air was stifling, thick with the smell of burning coal and machine oil. Pipes lined the walls, hissing and spitting with superheated steam. One wrong move and she could be scalded alive. Her plan was simple but risky. She needed to overload the boiler that powered the crushing machine. By hot-wiring the pressure regulators, she could force it to build up too much steam, causing it to backfire and hopefully disable the machine. It was a dangerous gamble. If she miscalculated, the whole place could explode. But it was the only chance Elsie had. Clara pulled a small multi-tool from her duster pocket. It was a marvel of engineering, a combination wrench, screwdriver, and wire cutter all rolled into one. She had designed it herself, of course. She started to work, her nimble fingers tracing the steam pipes, searching for the pressure regulators. Sparks flew as she cut wires and reconnected them in a new configuration. The heat was intense, sweat dripping down her face. The noise was deafening, the constant roar of the boiler and the clanking of machinery threatening to drown out her thoughts. But Clara focused, her mind sharp and clear. She had to get this right. Elsie's life depended on it. She muttered to herself, reciting the equations she had calculated, double-checking her connections. Almost there, just a few more tweaks. And then hopefully a spectacular explosion of steam and twisted metal. A rescue mission that would go down in legend. Or, at the very least, get them both out of this mess alive. Time was running out. The grinding of the crushing machine grew louder, closer. Clara could feel the vibrations through the metal floor. Elsie was running out of time. She had to hurry. Suddenly, a gruff voice echoed through the tunnels. "What's all that racket down there?" "Check it out." Clara froze, her heart leaping into her throat. Someone was coming. She had to hide, and fast. She spotted a small alcove, barely big enough to squeeze into, tucked behind a tangle of pipes. She scrambled inside, pulling the pipes back into place to conceal her presence. The footsteps grew closer, the heavy tread of boots on the metal grating. A shadow fell across the alcove's entrance. Clara held her breath, every muscle tense. She could hear the guard's heavy breathing, the clink of his belt buckle. He paused, peering into the darkness. "Just rats," he muttered finally. "Crazy inventor probably scared them up." He spat on the floor and moved on, his footsteps fading into the distance. Clara let out a shaky breath, relief washing over her. That was close, too close. She couldn't afford any more distractions. She had to finish the job. Now. She crawled back out of the alcove, her fingers flying across the wires and regulators. The pressure gauge on the boiler was climbing steadily, the needle edging into the red zone. Any second now. But then, another obstacle. A small, mechanical drone, shaped like a metal bird, zipped past her head, its gears whirring. It was one of the inventor's surveillance devices patrolling the tunnels. If it spotted her, she was done for. Clara ducked, narrowly avoiding the drone's gaze. This was getting harder and harder, but she wasn't about to give up. Not now, not ever. Suddenly, a piercing shriek filled the air. The mechanical bird had spotted her. It swooped down, its tiny metal claws extended, ready to attack. Clara reacted instantly, throwing her wrench at the drone. The wrench connected with a satisfying clang, sending the bird spiraling out of control before crashing into a pile of scrap metal. But the damage was done. The alarm had been triggered. Red lights flashed throughout the workshop, and a klaxon blared, its deafening wail echoing through the tunnels. Clara knew she had seconds. She glanced at the pressure gauge. The needle was buried deep in the red, vibrating violently. The boiler was about to explode. She had to get out of there. But there wasn't time. With a final, desperate yank, she disconnected the last wire, completing the circuit. Then she braced herself. A deafening roar ripped through the workshop. The boiler shuddered, its metal straining against the immense pressure. Superheated steam erupted from every valve and seam, filling the tunnels with blinding white vapor. Gears screeched and twisted, metal groaned and buckled. The explosion was deafening, a cataclysm of steam and fury. Clara shielded her eyes, her ears ringing. The entire workshop shook, threatening to collapse around her. This was it. She had done it, but had she done enough? She stumbled blindly through the chaos, the scalding steam searing her skin. She had to reach Elsie. She had to get her out of there before it was too late. The air was thick with the smell of burning metal and the sound of collapsing machinery. It was a scene of utter devastation. But amidst the chaos, Clara pressed on, driven by a single, unwavering purpose: to save the woman trapped in the heart of the machine. The main chamber was a scene of utter devastation. The crushing machine, once a symbol of the mad inventor's power, was now a twisted wreck of metal. The force of the explosion had ripped apart its intricate gears, melting them into grotesque, misshapen blobs. The spiked plate, moments away from crushing Elsie, hung askew, suspended by a single, mangled chain. And Elsie. She was still strapped to the machine, but the ropes had been partially severed by the blast. She coughed, choking on the thick, acrid smoke. Her eyes were wide with terror, but she was alive. Clara stumbled into the chamber, coughing and sputtering. She could barely see through the swirling steam and smoke. "Elsie," she shouted, her voice hoarse, "I'm here." She rushed towards the machine, dodging falling debris and pools of scalding water. The heat was unbearable, but she pressed on, determined to reach Elsie. Finally, she reached the machine and began frantically cutting through the remaining ropes with her multi-tool. "Hold still," she said, her voice trembling. "Almost there." With a final snip, the last rope parted. Elsie slumped forward, weak and disoriented. Clara caught her, supporting her weight. "Can you walk?" Clara asked, her eyes searching Elsie's face. Elsie nodded weakly. "I think so." Together, they stumbled away from the machine, towards the exit. The workshop was collapsing around them, the walls groaning and the ceiling threatening to cave in. They had to get out, and fast. They were covered in soot and grime, their clothes torn and singed, but they were alive. They had survived the mad inventor's deadly trap, and as they staggered towards the exit, hand in hand, a flicker of hope ignited in their hearts. They had faced death and they had won. Now all that was left was to escape, together. They stumbled out of the workshop just as the main structure began to collapse. A tower of twisted metal and shattered glass crashed to the ground behind them, sending a cloud of dust and debris billowing into the air. They ran, their lungs burning, their legs aching, not daring to look back. Finally, they reached the edge of the workshop grounds, collapsing onto the sand, gasping for breath. The sun beat down on them, harsh and unforgiving, but after the darkness and chaos of the workshop, it felt almost welcoming. They lay there for a long moment, catching their breath, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. Elsie looked at Clara, her face streaked with soot, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You saved me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Clara shrugged, trying to downplay her heroism, just doing what anyone would do. But her eyes met Elsie's, and she couldn't deny the truth. She had risked everything to save this woman, and she would do it again. They were a sight to behold. Two women covered in grime and soot, their clothes torn and singed, their faces etched with exhaustion. But there was something else in their eyes, something that transcended the dirt and the danger. A spark of connection, a flicker of hope, a promise of something more. As the dust settled and the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, they sat in silence, side by side, watching the wreckage of the mad inventor's workshop smolder in the distance. They had survived, they had escaped, and somehow in the midst of the chaos and destruction, they had found each other. Their smoldering gaze sparked a silent promise, a love that could bloom even in the ashen remains of a mechanical nightmare. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling of the distant fire and the shallow rasp of their breaths. Elsie shivered, despite the desert heat. The adrenaline was beginning to wear off, leaving her feeling weak and shaky. Clara noticed and gently placed her arm around Elsie's shoulders, offering a silent source of warmth and comfort. Elsie leaned into Clara's embrace, grateful for the simple gesture. She looked up at Clara, really seeing her for the first time. Her face was smudged with soot, her goggles askew, but her eyes shone with an intensity that Elsie had never seen before. They were the eyes of a survivor, a fighter, a woman who wasn't afraid to face danger head-on. "Thank you," Elsie said again, her voice stronger this time, "for everything." Clara simply nodded, her gaze fixed on the burning wreckage. She wasn't used to being thanked, wasn't used to being seen as a hero. She had always been a loner, a rebel, someone who operated on the fringes of society. But now, standing here with Elsie, she felt something different. A sense of purpose, a feeling of connection. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the desert. The air grew cooler, and a gentle breeze rustled through the scattered metal scraps. Elsie and Clara sat in silence, their bodies touching, their hearts beating in unison. They were two women bound together by a shared experience, a bond forged in the fires of adversity. The mad inventor's workshop was gone, reduced to a pile of smoldering rubble. But from the ashes, something new was beginning to emerge. A spark of hope, a flicker of love, a promise of a future where anything was possible. And as they looked at each other, their eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude, admiration, and something more, they knew that their journey had just begun. The desert stretched before them, vast and unknown, but they wouldn't face it alone. They had each other, and that was all that mattered. Elsie found herself drawn to Clara's quiet strength. Before, she had only known the simple comforts of her father's bakery. Now she saw a different kind of strength, a strength born of courage and ingenuity. Clara was unlike anyone she had ever met, a whirlwind of gears and grit, with a heart hidden beneath a tough exterior. Clara, in turn, was captivated by Elsie's resilience. Despite the terror she had endured, Elsie still possessed a gentle spirit, a spark of kindness that shone through the soot and grime. Clara had always been a protector, but she had never felt this strong a desire to care for someone. As the last rays of sunlight faded, Clara pulled a blanket from her duster, offering it to Elsie. "It's not much, but it'll keep you warm." Elsie gratefully accepted the blanket, wrapping it around her shoulders. "Thank you," she said softly, her eyes meeting Clara's. In that moment, something shifted between them. A silent understanding, a shared acknowledgement of the intense emotions they had both experienced. It wasn't just gratitude or admiration. It was something deeper, something that resonated within their souls. It was a spark of attraction, a flicker of desire, a hint of something that could blossom into something beautiful. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the gentle whisper of the wind. They didn't need words. Their eyes spoke volumes, conveying the unspoken feelings that were swirling within them. Clara reached out and gently took Elsie's hand. Elsie didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Instead, she squeezed Clara's hand tightly, her fingers intertwining with Clara's. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. It was a declaration of trust, a promise of companionship, a symbol of the love that was beginning to bloom in the heart of the desert. A love forged in the heat of danger, a love that was stronger than any steam-powered machine, a love that was just beginning. "I don't know how you did it," Elsie said, breaking the comfortable silence. "You were so brave, so clever." "I was sure I was going to die." She squeezed Clara's hand tighter, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved my life, Clara. I'll never forget that." Clara shifted uncomfortably, unused to such heartfelt praise. "It wasn't a big deal," she mumbled, avoiding Elsie's gaze. "Just a bit of tinkering, really." Elsie chuckled softly. "Tinkering? You blew up the whole workshop. That's more than just tinkering." She reached out and gently touched Clara's cheek, her fingers tracing the line of her jaw. "You're amazing, Clara, really amazing." Clara finally met Elsie's gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. She saw genuine admiration in Elsie's eyes, a deep respect for her skills and her courage. It was a look that made her feel both humbled and incredibly proud. "I just did what I had to do," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't let him hurt you." "But you didn't even know me," Elsie protested. "Why would you risk your life for a stranger?" Clara hesitated, searching for the right words. "I don't know," she admitted finally. I couldn't stand the thought of someone being trapped like that. It wasn't right." She paused, then added softly, "Besides, you looked like you could use a bit of rescuing." Elsie smiled, her eyes sparkling in the moonlight. "I suppose I did at that." She leaned closer to Clara, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "So, what happens now, Miss Rescuer? Where do we go from here?" Clara looked away, scuffing her boot in the sand. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice softer now. "I hadn't really thought that far ahead." She had been so focused on the rescue, on getting Elsie out of the workshop, that she hadn't considered what came next. She was used to being alone, to drifting from town to town, solving problems and moving on. The idea of settling down, of building a life with someone was foreign to her. Scary, even, I guess. "I guess we should get out of here," she said, her gaze sweeping across the vast, empty desert. "The inventor will be back sooner or later, and he won't be happy." Elsie nodded, her hand still clasped tightly in Clara's. "Where will we go?" Clara shrugged. "Anywhere, everywhere, doesn't matter to me." She paused, then added hesitantly, unless you have somewhere you need to be." Elsie shook her head. "Nowhere special, my father, he passed away last year." "The bakery, it's just a memory now." A tear trickled down her cheek, leaving a clean streak in the soot. Clara gently wiped away the tear with her thumb. "Then it's settled," she said, her voice firm. "We'll go wherever the wind takes us." Together, she looked at Elsie, her eyes filled with a newfound determination. "But first, we need to find some water and a place to sleep, and maybe we can find a town where they don't build torture machines." She stood up, pulling Elsie to her feet. "Come on," she said, her voice regaining its usual confidence. "Let's get out of here, adventure awaits." And as they walked away from the smoldering ruins, hand in hand, they knew that their journey was just beginning. A journey filled with uncertainty, danger, and maybe, just maybe, a little bit of love. The immediate goal was simple: escape the desert. The mad inventor wouldn't let them go easily. He would be hunting them, tracking them across the barren landscape. They needed to find a town, a safe place where they could rest and resupply, and they needed to do it quickly. "Do you know which way to go?" Elsie asked, her eyes scanning the horizon. Clara squinted, studying the position of the sun. "There's a small trading post about a day's ride to the west," she said. "It's not much, but it's better than nothing." "A day's ride," Elsie repeated, her voice laced with concern. "We don't have horses." Clara smirked. "We don't need horses, we have this." She reached into her duster and pulled out a small, clockwork-powered contraption. It was a miniature steam engine mounted on a set of wheels. "What is that?" Elsie asked, her eyes wide with amazement. "I call it the Desert Hopper," Clara said proudly. "It's not fast, but it's reliable. And it'll get us where we need to go." She set the Desert Hopper on the ground and wound the clockwork mechanism. The engine sputtered to life, emitting a puff of steam and a series of rhythmic chugs. "Hop on," Clara said, gesturing to the small platform behind the engine. "It's going to be a bumpy ride." Elsie hesitated for a moment, then climbed onto the Desert Hopper, her hand gripping Clara's shoulder for support. Clara jumped on beside her, and with a final puff of steam, the little machine lurched forward, carrying them into the vast, unknown expanse of the desert. They had a long journey ahead of them, filled with danger and uncertainty. But they were together, and that was all that mattered. Their partnership was sealed, their shared goal clear: escape the desert and leave the mad inventor behind them forever. They hadn't been traveling for more than an hour when the desert hopper sputtered and coughed, its engine wheezing like an old man with a bad cough. The little machine slowed to a crawl, its wheels spinning uselessly in the sand. "What's wrong?" Elsie asked, her voice filled with concern. Clara frowned, examining the engine. "Sand," she muttered. "It's clogged the gears." She sighed. "We're going to have to stop and clean it out." They dismounted the desert hopper and Clara began to dismantle the engine, her nimble fingers working quickly and efficiently. But the sand was stubborn, clinging to every gear and crevice. "Here, let me help," Elsie said, kneeling beside Clara. Clara hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "All right, hand me that brush." Together, they worked to clean the engine, their hands brushing against each other as they reached for the tools. Elsie, despite her lack of mechanical experience, proved to be surprisingly helpful. She held the gears steady while Clara brushed away the sand, her gentle touch surprisingly effective. As they worked, they talked, sharing stories about their lives before the mad inventor. Elsie told Clara about her father's bakery, the smell of fresh bread, the warmth of the oven. Clara told Elsie about her travels, her tinkering, her passion for machines. They learned about each other's strengths and weaknesses, their hopes and dreams. And as they worked side by side, covered in sand and grease, their bond grew stronger. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the engine was clean. Clara reassembled the desert hopper, wound the clockwork mechanism, and with a triumphant puff of steam, the little machine sputtered back to life. "All right," Clara said, wiping her brow with her sleeve. "Let's get going." They climbed back onto the desert hopper, and with a renewed surge of power, the little machine carried them onward, into the heart of the desert. They had faced a challenge and they had overcome it, together. Their teamwork had been tested and they had passed with flying colors. Their partnership was stronger than ever. The sun began to set, painting the sky in vibrant hues of orange, pink, and purple. They rode in silence, the desert hopper chugging steadily across the sand. The trading post was still hours away, but they were making good progress. Suddenly Elsie gasped, pointing towards the horizon. "What's that?" Clara squinted, following Elsie's gaze. In the distance, a dark shape was rapidly approaching. It was a sandstorm, a swirling vortex of dust and wind, capable of swallowing them whole. "We need to find shelter," Clara said urgently. "Now." They scanned the landscape, searching for any sign of protection, but there was nothing, only endless sand. The storm was closing in, its roar growing louder with each passing second. "There," Elsie shouted, pointing to a small cluster of rocks in the distance. "Maybe we can take cover there." Clara nodded, urging the desert hopper forward, but the storm was too fast. It engulfed them in a swirling cloud of sand, blinding them and buffeting them with fierce winds. The desert hopper bucked and swayed, threatening to throw them off. Clara struggled to maintain control, her hands gripping the handlebars tightly. Elsie clung to Clara, her eyes squeezed shut, her face buried in Clara's back. "Hold on," Clara shouted, her voice barely audible above the roar of the storm. The wind howled, the sand stung their faces, and the desert hopper struggled to maintain its course. It was a desperate battle against the elements, a test of their courage and their resolve. But they didn't give up. They held on tight, their determination fueled by their shared desire to survive. And slowly, gradually, the storm began to subside. The wind died down, the sand cleared, and the sun peeked through the clouds, casting a golden glow on the ravaged landscape. They had made it. They had survived the sandstorm. And as they looked at each other, their faces covered in sand, their bodies trembling with exhaustion, they knew that their bond was stronger than ever. They had faced another challenge and they had overcome it, together. Their trust in each other was absolute. They could face anything as long as they had each other. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert, Clara and Elsie finally reached the trading post. It was a small, ramshackle settlement, consisting of a few weathered buildings huddled together for protection against the elements. But it was a welcome sight after their harrowing journey. They found a small room at the back of the trading post, a simple space with 2 cots and a wash basin. It wasn't much, but it was safe. They washed the sand from their faces, changed into clean clothes, and sat down to a simple meal of beans and biscuits. As they ate, they talked about their plans for the future. They didn't know where they were going or what they would do, but they knew that they would face it together. "What do you want to do?" Clara asked, her eyes searching Elsie's face. Elsie smiled. "I don't know," she said. "Maybe I'll open a bakery that doesn't use steam-powered ovens." Clara chuckled. "I like the sound of that, and maybe I'll help you build it. A bakery with all sorts of fancy gadgets and gizmos." They laughed, their voices echoing in the small room. It was a moment of pure joy, a celebration of their survival, a promise of a brighter future. As the night deepened, they climbed into their cots, exhausted but content. They lay in silence for a long time, listening to the sounds of the desert. "Thank you," Elsie whispered, her voice barely audible. "For what?" Clara asked. "For everything," Elsie said. "For saving me, for bringing me here, for giving me hope." Clara reached out and took Elsie's hand. "You don't need to thank me," she said softly. "We saved each other." They fell asleep, their hands clasped tightly together, their hearts filled with love and hope. The next morning they woke to the sound of the rising sun. They packed their belongings, said goodbye to the trading post owner, and climbed back onto the desert hopper. And as they rode off into the sunrise, their faces turned towards the vast, unknown expanse of the desert. They knew that their adventure was just beginning. Their future was uncertain, but their connection was undeniable. They were Clara and Elsie, 2 women who had faced death and found love in the heart of a mechanical nightmare, and they were ready to face whatever the future held together. The desert stretched before them, a canvas of endless possibilities, and they were ready to paint their own story, a story of courage, ingenuity, and love, a story that would be told for generations to come.